Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive. The rain had been falling in Brooklyn for 3 nights straight. Not a storm, no thunder, no lightning, just a steady drizzle that blurred the neon signs into long streaks of bleeding color. In the back seat of a steel gray Jaguar Mark II, Anthony "Tony" Ducks Corallo sat quietly, his face half lit by the passing glow of street lamps. He never touched the wheel. That was Jimmy the Zip's job, always early, always silent, the kind of man who blended into the hum of the night. Tony's power wasn't in being seen. It was in being remembered. He wore no gold chains, no flashy suits, no wide smiles at crowded restaurants like other mobsters did. His suits were plain but sharp, his words measured, his silence louder than any gunshot. The papers said he slipped past 20 arrests without a single conviction. To the feds, it was infuriating. To the streets, it was legend. That was why they called him Ducks. But as the Jaguar glided through the rain-slick streets, Tony knew the world was changing. Silence had kept him alive for decades. Soon, that same silence might be the very thing that betrayed him. The Jaguar slowed to a stop outside a warehouse in Red Hook. Rain dripped from rusted gutters, pooling in black puddles that mirrored the broken lights above. Tony stepped out, adjusting his silver cufflinks, his footsteps measured, almost soundless against the wet pavement. Jimmy stayed by the car, the door already half open, always waiting. Inside, 3 men sat around a bare wooden table, Carmine Persico from the Colombos, Benny Squints from the Lucchese's, and a man carrying Paul Castellano's orders. These weren't friends, not really. They were survivors clinging to the remains of the commission, the shadow council that once ruled New York like a hidden government. But by the late 70s, cracks were everywhere. Wiretaps were sharper, RICO had teeth, and men were starting to flip. Tony lit a cigarette, his movements slow, deliberate, and let the smoke curl upward. "You hear about Cleveland?" he asked. Persico nodded. 30 indictments, federal and state. An entire crew wiped out like termites under a boot. Benny Squints leaned forward. "Maybe it's time we go quiet, pull back." Tony shook his head. His voice was steady, almost gentle, but final. "We don't pull back. We bury the roots deeper." Still, as the words left his mouth, he felt something shift. Silence, his oldest weapon, suddenly seemed less like protection and more like a thin shield against a storm already breaking. Long before Jaguars and commission meetings, Tony had walked the cracked sidewalks of East Harlem with shoes too small and pockets too empty. Born in 1913 to Sicilian immigrants, he grew up in a world where silence didn't mean peace, it meant survival. His father bent over shoes in a tiny cobbler's shop until his back curved like a broken question mark. His mother never blinked when the landlord sent men with hammers to collect rent. They paid late once. Never again. At 8 years old, Tony saw his first death. A boy, barely 16, was stabbed outside the butcher shop over a pack of stolen cigarettes. The butcher never stopped cutting meat. Nobody screamed. The blood ran into the gutter like it belonged there. Tony just watched, hands in his pockets, his face blank. He didn't flinch, didn't cry. He learned then that silence wasn't weakness, it was power. By 15, school was gone. He ran packages between bars and gambling rooms, never stealing, never talking, always on time. Older men trusted him because he listened more than he spoke. That was when Johnny Dio noticed the quiet kid who never asked for anything, and Dio would be the first to open the door to something larger. Johnny Dio wasn't a man who wasted time on loud boys chasing fast money. He saw in Tony something sharper, discipline, patience, the kind of silence that could move mountains without anyone noticing. While others bragged, Tony carried himself like he had nothing to prove. Dio gave him work, more than just packages, and Tony delivered every time. No excuses, no mistakes. That was how trust was built in their world, not with bloodlines, but with results. By his early 20s, Tony was running errands that mattered. He wasn't swinging bats or pulling triggers. He was smoothing union disputes, moving money quietly, arranging introductions without leaving fingerprints. Men noticed how he never raised his voice, never reached for a gun, and yet always got his way. That was rarer than muscle, it was power without noise. He watched other young guys burn out fast, chasing crowns they hadn't earned, flashing cash in nightclubs, thinking they were untouchable. Most were dead before 30, buried in silk suits with empty pockets. Tony wasn't chasing glory. He was building control. Through the unions, trucking, and construction, he began weaving threads into the city itself. If you controlled the flow, you didn't need violence. You could choke a man without ever lifting a finger. By the 1950s, Tony's quiet climb had turned into something much bigger than money. He had learned that New York's real power didn't sit in smoky backrooms or dim clubs, it pulsed through the veins of the city, labor unions, concrete, trucks, and the men who worked them. If those streams flowed through him, he didn't need to shout, didn't need to show his face. He simply had to tighten or loosen the valves. He bought a modest townhouse in Forest Hills and kept 2 Jaguars, polished but rarely seen on crowded streets. There was no mansion, no headlines, no phone in his name. To neighbors, he was just another quiet man in a suit. But to the people who mattered, Tony was the gatekeeper. A deal couldn't move, a contract couldn't close, unless his shadow had passed over it first. He became known as Ducks because indictments slid off him like rain on glass. 20 arrests, 20 walks. The feds hated it. The streets whispered about it. Tony never gloated. He just lit another cigarette, checked his watch only when he wanted others to notice, and kept moving. His empire was made of silence, and silence was holding strong. The 1960s brought a shift Tony never trusted. Younger men were chasing heroin and cocaine, hungry for fast money, blind to the danger. To Tony, it wasn't about morality, it was about discipline. Drugs made men reckless, and recklessness left trails. Fast money is poison, he told his captains. It kills quicker than bullets. For a while, they listened. But the streets were growing louder. In 1973, when Carmine Tremonti was taken down on heavy heroin charges, the Lucchese family needed a steady hand. All eyes turned to Tony. He didn't throw a party or buy another Jaguar. He simply nodded, lit a cigarette, and went back to business. To him, being boss wasn't a title. It was a responsibility. Under his leadership, the families avoided open wars and bloody chaos. Meetings were calm, business stayed clean, and Tony's word carried across the commission. But outside forces were sharpening their knives. The FBI had new tools, wiretaps, surveillance, and the RICO Act, a law designed to strike the structure itself. Tony adjusted like he always did. No phones, no public meetings, no paper. Orders passed by word of mouth, 3 levels down. He became a ghost in his own empire. But even ghosts left footprints. By the early 1980s, Tony's careful silence was turning into a trap. The FBI didn't need him on the phone, they only needed someone close enough to slip. That someone was his own driver, Sal Avellino. For years, Tony trusted the Jaguar as his moving throne, a sealed chamber of quiet. But the car that once symbolized control had been bugged. Tiny microphones hid inside the dash, voice-activated, catching every word. Tony never barked orders. He never said murder or hit. But he spoke of unions, contracts, percentages, and deals. For a street man, those words meant nothing. For prosecutors armed with RICO, they were gold. Slowly, piece by piece, the myth of the untouchable ghost began to unravel. When the tapes finally made it into court, the illusion shattered. Tony's voice, steady, calm, and measured, filled the room. He wasn't folklore anymore. He was flesh and blood, the head of an empire they could finally pin down. He didn't panic. He didn't flinch. He sat with the same patience he'd carried since childhood. But deep down, he knew what had happened. The very silence that once protected him had turned into an echo chamber, betraying him word by word. The commission trial of 1985 wasn't just another case, it was a public stage, and Tony was placed at the center under a spotlight he had spent his whole life avoiding. The courtroom buzzed with reporters scribbling notes, agents leaning forward with smug grins, and jurors listening as if history itself was speaking. For decades, the government had chased shadows. Now, they had a voice, and it was Tony's. The tapes played one after another. Scratchy, full of static, but clear enough. We don't want nobody unionizing garbage unless it's us. Plain words, delivered in Tony's steady tone, but each sentence was a nail in the commission's coffin. Giuliani stood before the jury, pointing at Tony's photograph. "This is not folklore," he said. "This is the head of a criminal empire that controls unions and contracts in New York City. And we didn't need an informant, we have his voice." Around him, younger bosses shifted in their seats, some looking down, others staring blankly at the table. Tony sat still, his face unreadable, like a man already resigned to the verdict. He wasn't afraid of prison. What unsettled him was something far worse. The silence he had built his empire on had become the weapon used to destroy it. When the verdict came in 1986, Tony didn't break. 100 years for racketeering, extortion, and conspiracy, no parole, no bargaining. He simply buttoned his coat, stood up, and said, "Let's go then." The guards let him out like any other inmate, but everyone in that room knew they were watching the fall of one of the last true bosses. They sent him to USP Springfield, a high-security medical prison built for men too old or too famous to mix with the general population. The place was quiet in a way Tony understood. No reporters, no flashing cameras, no mobsters looking for favors. Just gray walls, long corridors, and the sound of keys clinking against steel doors. To the younger inmates, Tony was a mystery. Some thought he had been a general, others whispered he was a politician gone wrong. Few knew the truth, and Tony never corrected them. He spoke little, refused most visitors, and carried himself with the same steady calm he always had. But prison gave him time, too much time. From behind bars, he watched the life he once controlled collapse. Gotti's flash, new blood-chasing cameras, captains turning into informants. The mob wasn't being crushed by the feds. It was being strangled by its own noise. When the end finally came in 2019, Carmine Persico had spent more than half his life behind bars. He died at 85, still known as the boss of the Colombo family. News of his passing spread quickly, stirring mixed emotions. For law enforcement, it felt like the closing of a chapter they had fought for decades to end. For his enemies, it was a quiet relief, as though a shadow had finally lifted. But for his followers, it marked the loss of a man who had defied every rule, a man who proved that bars could never silence true authority. His story left behind more than blood and crime. It left a lesson about fear, respect, and the strange kind of power that can last even without freedom. Carmine the Snake Persico showed the world that a man could control an empire from a prison cell, turning weakness into strength and punishment into legend. His name still echoes in Mafia history, a reminder of how far determination can reach. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more stories like this one. The tale of Carmine Persico may be over, but his legend will never fade.